The world looks normal until you see it. Really see it. Not the surface-level understanding everyone accepts, but the machinery beneath. The invisible architecture of power, meaning and control that shapes everything you thought was natural. You're 28 years old, sitting in a corporate meeting about quarterly projections, and suddenly you see it. Not just the numbers on the spreadsheet, but the entire system of rationalization that turns human beings into calculable units, relationships into transactions, existence into optimization. Maybe it's the way your manager speaks about human capital without irony. Maybe it's the sudden recognition that everyone in this room has surrendered something essential to participate in this theater of productivity. Or maybe it's just the crushing realization that this isn't a temporary phase of life, but the fundamental structure of modern existence itself. And without warning, something ancient inside you recognizes the bars of a cage you've been living in since birth. If I keep pretending this is normal, I'll disappear completely into the machine. Max Weber spent his life documenting what happens when you truly see how modern society operates. Not the comforting myths we tell ourselves about progress and freedom, but the cold machinery of rationalization that he believed was transforming human existence into something unprecedented in history. What Weber discovered was dangerous not because it was false, but because it was true. And that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. It changes everything about how you move through the world. It isolates you from those who still accept the official story. It burdens you with knowledge that offers no easy solutions. Weber called this process the disenchantment of the world. But it was more than just the loss of magic and mystery. It was the systematic replacement of meaning with efficiency, of values with calculations, of human purposes with technical rationality. And Weber believed that once you truly understood this transformation, you faced a choice that would define your entire existence. You could either find a way to live consciously within the iron cage of modernity, or you could be crushed by the weight of seeing clearly in a world designed to keep people blind. Today, I'm going to show you Weber's most dangerous discovery about the architecture of modern life. Why seeing how the system really works either destroys you or transforms you into something the system cannot easily absorb. And why Weber believed that this burden of consciousness, while terrible, was also the only path to authentic existence in the modern world. But I need to warn you before we go deeper. What I'm about to reveal cannot be unlearned. Once you see the patterns Weber identified, you'll recognize them everywhere. In your workplace, your relationships, your own internal life. The comfort of unconscious participation in the system will no longer be available to you. So if you're content with how things are, if you prefer the ease of accepting the world as it presents itself, you should stop watching now. Because Weber's insights don't offer comfort. They offer clarity. And clarity, in a world built on necessary illusions, is its own form of suffering. Weber's discovery began not with grand theory, but with careful observation of something most people took for granted. He noticed that modern Western society had developed a unique form of organization that no other civilization in history had achieved at this scale. Everything, from government bureaucracy to capitalist enterprise, to scientific research to religious institutions, was being restructured according to the same underlying logic. Weber called this logic formal rationality, and it represented a fundamental break from how human beings had organized their existence for thousands of years. For most of human history, societies were organized around what Weber called substantive rationality. Actions were evaluated based on their alignment with ultimate values, religious commandments, traditional wisdom, or ethical principles. You did things because they were right, because they served sacred purposes, because they honored the ancestors, because they fulfilled spiritual obligations. The question wasn't, what is the most efficient means to achieve this end, but rather, what ends are worth pursuing at all? And what does our tradition, our faith, our understanding of the good tell us about how to live? But modern society operates differently. Formal rationality asks a much simpler question. What is the most efficient means to achieve a given end, regardless of whether that end itself is meaningful, valuable, or worth pursuing? Weber observed that this shift had transformed every institution in modern life. The bureaucratic office doesn't ask whether its regulations serve justice or human flourishing. It asks whether they can be applied systematically, predictably, calculably. The capitalist enterprise doesn't ask whether its products enhance human life or serve genuine needs. It asks whether they can be produced efficiently and sold profitably. The scientific laboratory doesn't ask whether its discoveries will make existence more meaningful or beautiful. It asks whether its methods yield reliable, reproducible results. This is what Weber meant by the disenchantment of the world. Not simply that people stopped believing in magic or gods, though that was part of it, but that an entire way of relating to reality had been replaced. The world was no longer enchanted, no longer filled with inherent meaning, purpose, and value waiting to be discovered. Instead, it became raw material to be organized, calculated, optimized according to formal, rational principles. And Weber recognized something that made this discovery truly dangerous. This process was irreversible. You couldn't go back to enchanted consciousness once you'd seen through it. The modern mind, trained in formal rationality, couldn't genuinely believe in the old gods, the sacred meanings, the traditional purposes that had once structured human existence. Those beliefs had been dissolved by the very logic that made modern society possible. The rationalization process that created science, bureaucracy, capitalism, and technological progress had also destroyed the foundations of meaning that previous generations took for granted. Weber wrote about this with something close to despair. We live in an age that has eaten from the tree of knowledge. We cannot unknow what we know about how the world actually works. We cannot return to naive faith in ultimate meanings handed down by tradition or revelation. We are, in Weber's haunting phrase, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, living in an iron cage of our own construction. But here's where Weber's analysis becomes even more disturbing. Most people don't consciously recognize they're living in this condition. They move through bureaucratic institutions, participate in capitalist markets, consume the products of rationalized production, all while maintaining various comfortable illusions about freedom, meaning, and progress. They tell themselves they're pursuing their dreams when they're really pursuing whatever the system has made available to pursue. They believe they're making free choices when they're selecting from predetermined options within a rationalized structure. They think they're living meaningful lives when they're really performing roles in a vast machinery of formal rationality that has no ultimate purpose beyond its own perpetuation. Weber observed that the system works best when people don't fully see it, when they accept its logic as natural, inevitable, simply the way things are. The danger comes when someone develops what Weber would call disenchanted consciousness. When you see clearly that the entire architecture of modern life is built on formal rationality, with no substantive foundation. When you recognize that efficiency has replaced meaning as the organizing principle of existence. When you understand that the iron cage isn't a temporary condition, but the permanent structure of modernity itself. Because once you see this clearly, several things happen that make normal participation in the system nearly impossible. First, you can no longer take your daily activities at face value. Every email you send, every meeting you attend, every task you complete reveals itself as part of a rationalized process that exists for its own sake, not because it serves any ultimate human purpose. The meaning you once found in your work, your role, your contribution to the organization evaporates once you see it's all just formal rationality operating according to its own internal logic. Second, you become acutely aware of how language itself has been colonized by the system. People speak in the vocabulary of optimization, efficiency, productivity, metrics, outcomes, without any awareness that this language forecloses the possibility of asking deeper questions about value and meaning. You hear your colleagues discussing how to maximize human capital, or optimize workflows or scale solutions, and you recognize they're not evil or stupid. They're simply speaking the only language the rationalized system makes available. But you can no longer speak that language unselfconsciously. Every word feels like a betrayal of something essential. Third, you start noticing the psychological cost of living in a disenchanted world. The rates of depression, anxiety, addiction, the epidemic of meaninglessness that characterizes modern life. These aren't individual pathologies or chemical imbalances. They're the predictable consequence of trying to exist in a world structured by formal rationality that offers no substantive answers to the most fundamental human questions. Why am I here? What is worth caring about? How should I live? The system has no answers to these questions because they're not questions formal rationality can process. It can only ask how to achieve given ends efficiently, never which ends are worth pursuing at all. And this creates what Weber saw as the fundamental tragedy of modern existence. The very rationalization that made modern society possible, that generated unprecedented material prosperity, scientific knowledge, technological capability, that same process has made it nearly impossible to answer the questions that make existence bearable. We have gained the world and lost our souls, not because we're morally corrupt, but because we've built a civilization on formal rationality that systematically excludes substantive rationality from having any authority. At what point does seeing all this drive someone to complete withdrawal from the system? At what point does the burden of consciousness become unbearable? Weber studied various responses to this predicament, and he identified patterns that remain relevant over a century later. Some people, upon seeing clearly how the system works, collapse into what he would call irrational revolt. They reject modernity entirely, seeking refuge in traditional religions, radical politics, aesthetic movements, anything that promises escape from the iron cage. Weber observed that these revolts are themselves shaped by the rationalized world they're rejecting. They become organized movements with their own formal structures, their own efficiency metrics, their own bureaucratic apparatuses. The revolutionaries end up reproducing the very system they oppose. Others respond with cynical acceptance. They see the system clearly, recognize its meaninglessness, and decide to extract whatever personal advantages they can while maintaining ironic distance from any genuine commitment. Weber noted that this cynicism, while psychologically protective in the short term, eventually hollows out the person completely. You cannot live sustainably in a state of constant ironic detachment from your own existence. The corrosion spreads inward until there's nothing left but the performance. Still others try to carve out private spheres of meaning while publicly participating in the rationalized system. They maintain their bureaucratic careers, their market transactions, their formal rational activities, but invest their real emotional and spiritual energy in family, hobbies, creative pursuits, personal relationships that seem to exist outside the iron cage. Weber was sympathetic to this response, but recognized its fundamental instability. The rationalized sphere constantly expands, colonizing more and more of what was once private and meaningful. Your hobbies become side hustles. Your family relationships get scheduled in calendar blocks. Your creative pursuits get evaluated by engagement metrics. The iron cage has no respect for boundaries. It transforms everything it touches into material for rationalized processing. And beneath all these responses, Weber identified a deeper problem. The very consciousness that allows you to see the system clearly is itself a product of that system. Your ability to analyze, to critique, to recognize patterns of rationalization, this is formal rationality turned on itself. You're using the master's tools to examine the master's house, and the tools themselves carry the logic of what they're examining. This creates a kind of existential vertigo. You cannot step outside the system to critique it, because there is no outside. The iron cage doesn't just constrain your actions. It structures your very capacity to think about alternatives. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in what I'm describing, write in the comments, "I see the cage now," because that simple acknowledgement connects you with others carrying the same burden of consciousness. You're not alone in seeing what most people remain blind to, and sometimes just knowing others see it too makes the weight slightly more bearable. Your comment creates a moment of solidarity among those who can no longer unsee what Weber revealed about modern existence. So write it now. I see the cage now, and let that be a marker of your refusal to pretend anymore that the system is natural, inevitable, or acceptable simply because it exists. Weber himself struggled profoundly with the implications of his own discoveries. His nervous breakdown in the early 1900s wasn't simply personal pathology. It was the consequence of seeing too clearly the structure of modern rationalization and finding no satisfactory way to live consciously within it. He emerged from that crisis with what he called an ethic of responsibility, a framework for navigating the iron cage without either naive acceptance or self-destructive revolt. Weber's ethic of responsibility begins with radical acknowledgement. You must see clearly how the system actually works, without comforting illusions or ideological mystifications. You must recognize that formal rationality dominates modern institutions, and that this domination is irreversible. You cannot go back to enchanted consciousness. You cannot pretend the old gods still speak with authority. You cannot act as if ultimate meanings are simply given rather than chosen in the face of meaninglessness. But this clear sight doesn't lead to paralysis or despair. It leads to what Weber called value commitment in a disenchanted world. Here's how this works. Weber recognized that formal rationality cannot provide substantive values. It cannot tell you what's worth caring about, what purposes are worth serving, what kind of life is worth living. Those questions require substantive rationality, commitment to values that cannot be rationally justified but must be chosen. In a disenchanted world, you must consciously select the values you'll serve, knowing they have no cosmic or universal foundation, knowing they're your choice rather than objective truths. Weber himself chose the values of intellectual honesty, scientific rigor, and what he called the demands of the day. He committed to scholarship not because scholarship was cosmically meaningful, but because he decided it was worth doing. He maintained professional responsibilities not because bureaucratic roles were inherently valuable, but because he chose to honor the commitments he'd undertaken. This is what Weber meant by vocation in the modern world. Not a calling from God or destiny or some external source of meaning, but a conscious commitment to values and purposes you've chosen, pursued with full awareness that they have no foundation beyond your choice to honor them. The ethic of responsibility involves three elements that distinguish it from both naive acceptance and irrational revolt. First, consequence awareness. You must understand that every action within the rationalized system produces effects you cannot fully control. Bureaucratic decisions ripple through institutional structures in ways no individual can predict. Market transactions generate systemic consequences that exceed anyone's intentions. Scientific discoveries enable technologies whose ultimate impacts remain unknown. The ethic of responsibility requires you to think carefully about probable consequences of your actions within these rationalized systems, even as you acknowledge you cannot fully control outcomes. Second, tragic consciousness. You must accept that living responsibly in a disenchanted world involves unavoidable conflicts between values, irreducible tensions between competing goods, situations where any choice involves sacrificing something valuable. Weber rejected utopian thinking that promised perfect solutions or final reconciliations. He insisted that mature existence means accepting tragic dimensions of the human condition without seeking escape into comforting fantasies. Third, sustained commitment despite meaninglessness. This is perhaps the hardest element. You must find ways to honor your chosen values and pursue your selected purposes even while maintaining clear sight of the fact that they have no cosmic foundation, that the system doesn't care about your commitments, that formal rationality will continue grinding away regardless of your substantive concerns. Weber believed this required a kind of heroism specific to modernity. Not the heroism of the warrior or the saint, but the heroism of continuing to care about what you've chosen to care about in a world structured to make such caring seem absurd. The person living the ethic of responsibility understands they're choosing to create islands of substantive meaning within an ocean of formal rationality. They know these islands are fragile, temporary, maintained only by ongoing commitment. They recognize that the iron cage will outlast them, that their individual efforts cannot transform the fundamental structure of modernity. And yet they continue. They show up to work they've chosen to find valuable. They honor relationships they've decided to treat as significant. They pursue projects they've committed to as worthy. Not because these things are objectively meaningful, but because they've chosen to act as if they are. Weber saw this as the only form of authenticity available in the modern world, not the authenticity of expressing your true self, because the disenchanted consciousness recognizes there is no essential true self waiting to be expressed, but the authenticity of taking responsibility for your choices and commitments in full awareness that they're choices rather than cosmic imperatives. This is tremendously difficult. It requires holding two apparently contradictory truths simultaneously. The world is disenchanted, structured by meaningless formal rationality, offering no ultimate foundations for value or purpose. And yet, you must live as if your chosen commitments matter, as if your selected values are worth honoring, as if your decisions have significance. Most people cannot sustain this tension. They collapse into one side or the other. Either they embrace the iron cage completely, accepting that efficiency and optimization are the only real values, becoming what Weber called specialists without spirit. Or they flee into various forms of re-enchantment, desperate attempts to restore cosmic meaning through New Age spirituality, political ideology, consumer identity, anything that promises escape from the burden of choosing your own values in a meaningless world. But Weber believed a third path exists, though few can walk it. The path of clear-sighted value commitment, of seeing the iron cage fully, while refusing to let that sight destroy your capacity to care about what you've chosen to care about. Of understanding that formal rationality dominates modern institutions while insisting on carving out spaces where substantive rationality still governs your choices. Of accepting disenchantment intellectually while maintaining the discipline to live as if your commitments have meaning. This is why Weber described his own position as tragic liberalism. Liberal because it insists on individual responsibility for choosing values and purposes. Tragic because it acknowledges these choices have no foundation beyond the choosing itself. The iron cage remains. The disenchantment is permanent. The rationalization process continues grinding away, transforming more and more of existence into calculable material for efficient processing. But within these constraints, the ethic of responsibility creates room for something Weber valued above all else: intellectual and moral integrity. The refusal to lie to yourself about the conditions of modern existence. The determination to see clearly and act responsibly despite what you see. Weber studied historical figures who embodied different responses to similar predicaments, and these examples illuminate both successful and failed attempts to live consciously within rationalized systems. Consider Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer who Weber analyzed extensively. Luther confronted an established religious system, the Catholic Church of the early 1500s, that had become thoroughly rationalized in its own way. It offered salvation through calculable exchanges, purchase indulgences, perform prescribed rituals, follow established procedures, and receive guaranteed spiritual benefits. The system worked like a bureaucracy, processing souls according to formal protocols. Luther's revolt wasn't simply religious. It was a rebellion against formal rationality colonizing the realm of faith. He insisted that salvation couldn't be reduced to transactions and calculations. His doctrine of justification by faith alone represented a demand for substantive over formal rationality in spiritual matters. You couldn't purchase or earn God's grace through efficient performance of religious duties. It required something incalculable, a leap of faith that formal rationality couldn't process. But Weber noted the profound irony. Luther's revolt against rationalized religion unleashed forces that produced even more thoroughgoing rationalization. Protestantism, especially in its Calvinist forms, generated what Weber called the Protestant ethic, a systematic approach to worldly activity that treated success in business and profession as signs of election, that turned everyday work into a calling, that created the psychological foundations for modern capitalism. The very movement that began as revolt against formal rationality ended up accelerating the rationalization of economic life. Luther himself spent his later years watching his Reformation transform into the very kind of systematized doctrine he'd originally opposed. Weber saw this as exemplifying a general pattern. Attempts to escape or transcend the iron cage often contribute to building stronger cages. The rationalization process absorbs and transforms even movements designed to resist it. Compare Luther's trajectory with Weber's analysis of ancient prophets, particularly those in Judaism. The Hebrew prophets operated in a different world, one where substantive rationality still had cultural authority. When they challenged existing institutions, they could appeal to covenant obligations, divine commandments, ultimate purposes that their audiences recognized as authoritative. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos. These figures could call kings and peoples back to substantive values because those values still structured consciousness. Weber believed prophetic authority was no longer available in the modern world. You cannot stand before rationalized institutions and appeal to cosmic purposes or divine imperatives that formal rationality would recognize as binding. The system has no mechanism for processing such appeals. It can only ask whether your challenge can be operationalized efficiently. This is why Weber described modern existence as requiring charisma of a different kind. Not the charisma of the prophet speaking ultimate truths, but the charisma of the person who consciously chooses values worth serving and pursues them with such integrity that others recognize authentic commitment even without believing those values have cosmic foundation. Weber himself attempted to embody this form of modern charisma through his scholarly work. He didn't claim his studies of rationalization revealed objective truths about ultimate meanings. He presented them as careful analyses of how modern society actually functions, offered to anyone willing to see clearly. His lectures became legendary, not because he preached solutions, but because he refused comforting illusions. He told students that science cannot tell you how to live, what values to serve, what purposes are worth pursuing. It can only help you understand the consequences of different choices and the structure of the world in which you'll make those choices. Many students found this devastating. They came seeking guidance, meaning direction. Weber gave them clarity about their predicament but insisted they must choose their own responses. Some abandoned academic life entirely, unable to bear the burden of consciousness without redemptive promises. Others found Weber's refusal to offer false comfort strangely liberating. If no authority could tell them how to live, then they bore full responsibility for becoming who they chose to become. This brings us to Weber's most controversial and dangerous insight, the one that truly separates those who can bear clear sight from those who cannot. Weber argued that the rationalization process, while irreversible at the civilizational level, doesn't determine individual consciousness completely. You can see the iron cage clearly and still choose how to relate to it. Most people respond to this claim with immediate objection. How can you choose your relationship to forces that structure your entire existence? How can individual consciousness resist systemic rationalization? Isn't this just another comforting illusion? The myth of individual freedom in the face of totalizing systems? Weber anticipated these objections, and his response reveals why his analysis remains dangerous rather than merely pessimistic. He agreed that you cannot escape the iron cage, cannot destroy it, cannot transcend it, cannot go back to a pre-rationalized world. The structure of modern society is what it is. But, Weber insisted, you can choose the attitude with which you inhabit that structure. You can participate in rationalized institutions while maintaining ironic distance from their logic. You can perform bureaucratic roles while refusing to identify completely with those roles. You can engage in market transactions while treating them as instrumental necessities rather than ultimate meanings. This is what Weber meant by inner distance, a psychological posture that allows you to function within the system while preserving a part of consciousness that stands apart from it, that evaluates it by standards the system itself doesn't recognize. Weber believed this inner distance was actually easier to maintain for those who saw the system clearly than for those who remained unconscious of it. When you don't recognize the iron cage, you have no defense against it colonizing your entire consciousness. You accept its logic as natural, its values as obvious, its purposes as your own. But when you see the cage, you can consciously decide which aspects of yourself you'll allow to be processed by formal rationality and which you'll protect from it. You can treat your job as an economic necessity without letting it define your identity. You can participate in bureaucratic procedures without believing they represent ultimate order. You can consume products of rationalized production without letting consumption patterns determine your selfhood. This inner distance requires constant vigilance because the rationalization process continuously attempts to colonize every aspect of consciousness. You must repeatedly remind yourself that the system's logic is not the only logic, that efficiency is not the only value, that calculability is not the same as meaning. Weber developed specific practices for maintaining this vigilance, drawn from his own struggle with disenchanted consciousness. First, regular intellectual work on understanding how rationalization operates. You combat the system's naturalness by studying its historical development, its internal logic, its specific mechanisms. Weber's own scholarship served this purpose. By tracing how formal rationality emerged and transformed various institutions, he kept himself aware that current arrangements are historical constructions rather than inevitable realities. Second, conscious cultivation of domains where substantive rather than formal rationality governs. For Weber, this meant scholarship pursued for its own sake, intellectual friendships where authentic dialogue occurred, aesthetic appreciation of music and art, intimate relationships protected from instrumental logic. These weren't escapes from the iron cage, but zones within it where different values could be honored. Third, and perhaps most importantly, refusal of what Weber called speaking prophetically when you cannot. He insisted on maintaining clear distinctions between what formal rationality could determine and what required substantive value commitments. In scholarly work, he presented analyses without pretending they yielded ultimate meanings. In political engagement, he advocated for positions based on values he'd chosen, without claiming those values had cosmic authority. In personal relationships, he honored commitments he'd undertaken without pretending they were anything other than chosen commitments. This intellectual honesty, this refusal to claim more certainty than disenchanted consciousness allows. This was Weber's core discipline for living authentically within the iron cage. It made him tremendously difficult to be around. People wanted answers, guidance, certainty. Weber gave them clarity about questions they had to answer themselves. They wanted him to endorse their values and purposes. Weber showed them that all values and purposes in a disenchanted world are chosen rather than discovered. They wanted escape from the burden of freedom. Weber insisted they face it fully, but Weber recognized that most people couldn't sustain this level of consciousness, and he didn't judge them for it. He understood that seeing clearly is exhausting, isolating, often crippling. The iron cage is more bearable when you don't recognize it as a cage. Formal rationality is easier to navigate when you accept it as simply how things are. Disenchantment hurts less when you don't spend time thinking about what's been lost. So Weber expected that clear-sighted consciousness would remain rare. Most people would continue participating in rationalized systems without recognizing their underlying logic. They'd tell themselves stories about progress, freedom, individual achievement that the system itself encourages. They'd find meaning in instrumental successes, satisfaction in efficiency gains, purpose in optimization projects. And Weber didn't see this as moral failure. It was adaptive. The iron cage functions best when its inhabitants don't spend too much time examining what it's made of. But for those who do see clearly, Weber offered no false hope, but also no counsel of despair. You can live consciously within the iron cage. You can maintain inner distance from its logic. You can choose values worth serving even without cosmic justification. You can honor commitments you've selected even while understanding they're merely chosen. And this capacity for clear-sighted value commitment, Weber believed, represented the highest form of authenticity available in modernity. Not authenticity as expressing your essential self, because disenchanted consciousness recognizes there is no essential self, but authenticity is taking full responsibility for who you choose to become and what you choose to serve in a world that offers no guidance beyond efficiency and calculation. The danger of seeing how the system really works is that you can no longer participate unconsciously. You can no longer accept the official story. You can no longer derive meaning from sources the system makes easily available. But the opportunity that danger creates is the chance to live with full awareness of your condition, choosing your values consciously, honoring your commitments authentically, maintaining inner freedom even within external constraints. Weber spent his final years watching the rationalization process accelerate, watching bureaucratic states expand their control, watching capitalism transform more and more of existence into commodity relationships, watching science produce technologies whose purposes remained perpetually deferred. He saw the iron cage growing stronger, more comprehensive, more inescapable, and he saw most people welcoming it, praising efficiency and progress, celebrating rationalization as liberation. In his last major work, Weber wrote about what he called specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, people who had accepted formal rationality so completely that they'd lost capacity for substantive valuation altogether. Who could calculate everything and value nothing? Who could optimize processes without asking whether the purposes served by those processes were worth pursuing? Who could achieve tremendous instrumental mastery while remaining children with regard to questions of meaning? Weber feared this represented the future of humanity, not dramatic collapse or revolutionary transformation, but gradual hollowing out of consciousness until nothing remained but efficient processing of meaningless material according to formal protocols. Yet Weber refused apocalyptic thinking. He believed the rationalization process would continue, the iron cage would persist, But spaces for conscious resistance would also remain. Not organized movements or collective revolts. Those would be absorbed and rationalized. But individuals here and there who saw clearly and chose to live differently, who maintained inner distance despite external participation, who honored substantive values they'd consciously chosen despite knowing those values had no cosmic foundation, who accepted tragic dimensions of modern existence without seeking escape into comforting illusions. These individuals wouldn't transform the system. Their choices wouldn't reverse rationalization or restore enchantment, but they would demonstrate that clear-sighted authentic existence remained possible even within the iron cage. And their example would matter to others struggling with the burden of consciousness, would show that seeing clearly doesn't require paralysis or despair, would prove that responsibility and integrity can be maintained even in a disenchanted world. This is Weber's ultimate message to those who see how the system really works. You cannot escape it. You cannot destroy it. You cannot pretend you don't see it. But you can choose how you inhabit it. You can maintain domains where substantive rather than formal rationality governs. You can honor values and commitments you've consciously selected. You can live with integrity despite knowing the world offers no ultimate meanings to justify your choices. And this capacity for clear-sighted value commitment, while it doesn't solve the problem of modernity, allows you to live authentically within its constraints. The iron cage remains, but you can be conscious of the bars. And that consciousness, while painful, is also the only freedom modernity makes available. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey into Weber's dangerous discovery, you're ready to explore how these insights about rationalization connect to another aspect of modern consciousness. In my video on Weber's analysis of charismatic authority in a rationalized world, I reveal how genuine leadership and inspiration become nearly impossible once bureaucracy fully establishes itself, and what Weber believed were the only conditions under which authentic charisma could still emerge. That understanding completes the picture of how consciousness navigates the iron cage, so make sure to watch that next. Until we meet again in the next reflection, remember that seeing clearly is its own form of resistance. Keep questioning the systems that present themselves as natural. Thank you for walking this difficult path of consciousness with me.